And he's just signing so many that all he does is sit and sign executive orders, because all this stuff was written by think tanks in Washington, funded by billionaires. But Trump keeps saying things like, "Oh, they'll give in. China will give in." He said that recently. He said they're a paper tiger, essentially. That the U.S. is the most powerful country. He really overstates the power of the U.S. and he really thinks, as he claimed in his inauguration speech, that the U.S. is no longer in decline, when everyone around the world can see clearly that the U.S. is in very significant decline. And you mentioned BRICS. I mean, he gave this bizarre response to a journalist who was asking about Spain and about how Trump is pressuring countries in NATO to increase their military spending to 5% of GDP, over double the previous target of 2% of GDP. That is a massive increase in military spending. And he was asked about Spain, and Spain doesn't spend. Trump complained that Spain doesn't spend enough on its military. And then he also said that Spain is a BRICS country, which it's not. I mean, that's not true. There are no European countries in BRICS. BRICS is led by the Global South. I mean, Russia is now basically part of Asia, Eurasia more broadly. It's been kicked out of Europe, right? So that was a very bizarre comment. And then he said, Spain is part of BRICS. And by the way, I'm going to put 100% tariffs on BRICS countries so they can't trade with the United States. I mean, okay, they can't trade with the United States, so they'll trade with each other. Again, he has this idea that if countries can't trade with the U.S., oh no, there's tariffs. It's the end of the world. I mean, the world does not revolve around the U.S. The U.S. economy is actually much weaker than he thinks it is. And this brings us to Russia. So, of course, Russia's part of BRICS. Trump has constantly threatened BRICS. But what is he going to do? Put more sanctions on Russia? I mean, Russia's already one of the most sanctioned countries in history. Well, he just said in that comment that he's going to instead do tariffs. Okay, how much trade is Russia doing with the United States? Very little. So Russia will do less trade with the U.S. and more trade with China and India, which is what it's been doing. So again, Trump thinks that tariffs and sanctions and the dollar are this silver bullet and that there are no alternatives to the United States. I mean, he's living in the 1980s still, when the U.S. economy was very powerful. It's much weaker today. It's been deindustrialized. It has very few manufacturing capabilities. China produces everything. The U.S. produces nothing. And even in high tech, China has caught up very quickly. Even this week, there is news that China has released AI models that are better and cheaper than U.S. AI models, like an open AI. So, I mean, I think in the next few years, it's going to be made very clear to Trump that the U.S. is not as powerful as he thinks it is. And the thing about claiming that he was going to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours, or at one point he actually said that he would end it before he even became president, yes. During the transition period. Obviously, that didn't happen. Trump, again, has this very arrogant idea that he can just force everyone to make a deal. And of course, when he says that, it's always a deal that's advantageous to the U.S. But a lot of these countries, they have interests that are more important than making a deal with the U.S. Russia, he thinks that Russia just is begging the U.S. for a deal. But Russia is not going to give in to some of its core demands, which is that Ukraine can never join NATO. Ukraine must be demilitarized. The Donbass is never going to be part of Ukraine, yet alone Crimea. It's not even up for debate. And yet Trump thinks he can just pressure these countries and force them to make a deal because he thinks that somehow he is uniquely good at making deals and everyone before him was just stupid. I mean, this is the same thing with Iran. He says, I'm going to make a new deal with Iran. Why in the hell would Iran possibly make a new deal with the United States, especially with Trump, after he was the one who tore up the previous deal? Or another example is TikTok. Trump, it is true, and this is actually very smart politically on Trump's behalf. It was very smart. It was really stupid of Biden. Trump originally tried to ban TikTok by signing an executive order in 2020. And then U.S. courts blocked that order. And then Biden came in and he banned TikTok on the second last day of his administration. And Trump played this for political points and he unbanned TikTok. However, there's a big asterisk there. If you read the order that Trump signed, it's only for 75 days. So Trump again thinks that he can pressure the company ByteDance to sell TikTok, one of its most valuable properties. He thinks that he can pressure them because he's uniquely good at making deals. And that's why it's only 75 days. And if ByteDance doesn't sell TikTok, TikTok will be banned again. But in order to make a deal with another side, you have to give them something they want. What is the U.S. going to give to ByteDance? Nothing. Well, access to the U.S. market. But TikTok doesn't need the U.S. market. TikTok has many other countries. The biggest market for TikTok is Indonesia, not the United States. Similarly, for Russia, what is Trump going to offer Russia if he wants to make a deal? He's saying, okay, we're going to put tariffs on. I mean, that's not going to do anything. Look how many sanctions are on Russia.
On his Truth Social, we can read exactly what he said. He said, "I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and always had a very good relationship with President Putin." Not true. And this despite the radical left's Russia hoax. We must never forget Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing almost 60 million lives. All that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything sold by Russia to the U.S. and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. Let's make a deal. So it appears that punishment, Ben, is the way that Donald Trump believes that he's going to get a deal on this, or perhaps he doesn't believe he can get a deal on this at all. What do you think?
No, I mean, I just looking up the data here on Russia's trade with the U.S., which the latest data is from 2022. So, I mean, this data is really, even if you can believe the data, which is probably exaggerated, this is from 2022, and Russia was selling the U.S. some refined petroleum, about $5 billion, and I'm sure since then it's fallen even further. So, like that is one of the easiest things to replace. There are so many countries selling petroleum. I mean, refined petroleum. Aren't as many, but still, I mean, it's not like the U.S. can't get oil from somewhere else. The U.S. is actually the world's largest oil producer at this point. So, like, what this idea that, again, he can just force Russia to do what the U.S. wants with the threat of blocking off access to the U.S. market. Russia already sells very little to the U.S. Russia's main trading partners are now BRICS countries. There's been a huge shift in the past few years, especially with the proxy war in Ukraine. And Russia has replaced a lot of its trade with the West with trade with China, India, Turkey, with other countries in Asia. So again, Trump, he's living in this little bubble. Also, it's so funny when you read these posts that he makes on his website. It just looks crazy, like with all of the capital letters and stuff. It looks like one of those spam emails they send you about like you need to act now or your computer is going to blow up. So again, when you're negotiating with another side, you have to offer them something. What is Trump going to offer Russia? Well, if he's willing to accept those demands that Ukraine will never become part of NATO, that Ukraine will be demilitarized, that the Donbass and Crimea will permanently remain part of Russia, I'm sure Russia will be more than happy, very happy to make a deal. But is Trump going to go along with that deal? Maybe Trump personally would be willing to do so. He probably doesn't even really know what the Donbass is. But let's also keep in mind the people around Trump. I already mentioned Marco Rubio is now Secretary of State. Rubio is a very hawkish anti-Russia voice. I mean, a lot of Rubio's rhetoric has focused on countering China. In the Senate hearing that he gave in order to be confirmed, it was 3 hours, and he was just constantly fear-mongering about China. He called China the biggest threat to the U.S., etc. He was fear-mongering about Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. Okay, so we know this guy's a neocon. But Rubio is also very anti-Russia. Okay, look at Donald Trump's national security advisor, who hasn't been officially confirmed yet, but he very likely will be confirmed. Mike Waltz, another neocon, another anti-Russia voice in the administration. So Trump is being advised by people who are very anti-Russia, even if he would be willing to make this kind of deal. I mean, I'm still pretty skeptical. Maybe he will at the end of the day, but it's, threatening taxes on Russia. How is he going to put taxes on Russia? I mean, he means tariffs, but again,
Right.
what is the point of putting tariffs on a country if because of sanctions, they're doing almost no trade with you anyway?
Ben, talk about tariffs, particularly from a geopolitical economic standpoint, because Trump loves to wield this idea of tariffs versus sanctions. He says sanctions bad, mainly because he wants to put that on Biden as the primary tool that Biden was using against Russia in particular, but really worldwide. But tariffs good. So talk about tariffs. I've heard that they could potentially backfire on those doing the tariffing.
Yeah, they definitely could backfire. A quick note on sanctions first. Sanctions are, of course, bipartisan. It's become the kind of main form of war waged by the U.S. because most of the wars that the U.S. wages are actually economic wars. 1/3 of all countries on earth are facing some form of U.S. sanctions, including 60% of low-income countries, of poor countries. And this has been completely bipartisan. Go back to the Bush administration in particular and the so-called war on terror. There was a massive explosion in the use of sanctions. And then every president since has only increased the number. And you can look at a chart of the number of sanctions, and it just keeps going up. It's a straight line, or it's not a straight line. It's a line that goes up, right? But consistently. So when Trump was president, he also massively expanded the use of sanctions, especially on countries like Venezuela and Cuba and Iran. So, by the way, when Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, what was the Iran nuclear deal? It was an agreement to lift the illegal unilateral sanctions that the U.S. had put on Iran in return for Iran agreeing to halt its nuclear program. So what did Trump do? He ended the deal unilaterally, which violated international law because the deal was written into international law through a UN Security Council resolution. But the point is that Trump ended the deal and he put tons of sanctions on Iran. What did he do to Venezuela? He put tons of sanctions on Venezuela, an economic blockade in Venezuela. He put hundreds more sanctions on Cuba as well, another country that's one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. So this is bipartisan. Of course, Biden also massively, again, look at the chart. It just keeps going up. Biden came in and he massively increased the number of sanctions on Russia, right? So now Trump says, okay, instead of sanctions, I'm going to do tariffs, partially because so many of these countries are so heavily sanctioned, they can't even put on more sanctions. I mean, what can they sanction even more in Russia? Everything's sanctioned. What can they sanction more in Iran? Everything's sanctioned. Venezuela, everything's sanctioned. So now he's saying tariffs. Okay, how do tariffs work? Trump wants people to believe that other countries pay for tariffs. That's not true. Tariffs are paid by importers in the United States. It is a tax on imports. That tax is borne by consumers in the United States in the form of higher costs of imported goods. And given that the U.S. deindustrialized its economy and produces almost nothing locally, that means that everything will become more expensive. Everything that's imported, which is most things, right? Now, defenders of Trump's tariffs will argue that there were other mechanisms by which other countries bore some of the cost, not all of the cost, but some of the costs of tariffs. So as an example, it's not wrong that when Trump put tariffs on China during his trade war during his first term, that the Chinese currency, the renminbi, also known as the yuan, did fall against the dollar. And as the renminbi fell against the dollar, it decreased the cost of Chinese exports, making them more competitive. Therefore, they were cheaper. So even though there were tariffs on them in the U.S., the cost increase was not that high domestically in the U.S. because of the depreciation of the renminbi. That's actually true. Now, it doesn't account for 100% of the cost of the tariffs. So there are many different products, for instance, washing machines, that there are studies that showed that washing machines became more expensive in the US because of the Trump tariffs. But at the same time, this is ironic because Trump accuses China of supposedly manipulating its currency, of intentionally devaluing the yuan against the dollar to make Chinese exports more competitive. Well, he's complaining about that, which China says it doesn't do. And yet now he's putting more tariffs on China, which is going to lead to a further depreciation of the yuan against the dollar and increase the competitiveness of Chinese exports when China has $1 trillion surplus. So again, I mean, everything that Trump's doing is just completely contradictory. He says we want to decrease the surplus that China has, its trade surplus, and we want it to appreciate its currency. But he's putting tariffs on that's leading to a further depreciation of the currency and likely an increase in China's trade surplus. He thinks tariffs are this panacea that can solve everything. And he and some billionaire friends like Mark Andreessen, who's a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, they claim that they can replace the income tax with tariffs, which is just mathematically completely false, totally bogus. Of course, they say that because they want to end taxes on the rich. And they say, oh, we'll replace it with tariffs, which is not true. The deficit will continue to massively explode. So, I mean, tariffs are not some magical panacea. Tariffs as a tool can work. I'm actually not against tariffs in certain circumstances. I'm not a free trader at all. You and I are not free traders. It's the neoliberals who are free traders. However, just putting up tariffs on everything is not a magical solution to making your economy stronger. Tariffs work in particular industries when you are trying to develop your local manufacturing capabilities, and you can create a competitive industry. And then after it becomes competitive internationally, you can lift the tariffs. So it's no longer artificially protected by this lack of competition internationally. This is what every advanced, wealthy country did. This is what the United States did. Ironically, it was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the US, who was known for promoting protectionism. It used to be known as the American School of Economics, which is very ironic because now the American school would be associated with neoliberalism, with Chicago, right? The University of Chicago. But go back to Alexander Hamilton. The whole idea was that the government should have state banking, which is what China has, that the government should heavily invest in public infrastructure, which is what China does, not the US, that the government should protect local manufacturing industries to develop a competitive advantage so they could actually compete with other established industries in other dominant economies. This is what the US did. This is what European countries did. This is what Japan did, what South Korea did. It's what China has done. But the thing is, Trump claims that you just put on tariffs on everything. That's not the solution. Okay, so he puts tariffs on everything, so then everything becomes more expensive. So, for instance, Trump says he wants to put on 60% tariffs on all Chinese goods. Okay, that means not only Chinese electric vehicles, which already have 100% tariffs on them, that also means shoes and textiles made in China. It also means toasters made in China. So is the U.S. planning on making a bunch of factories in the U.S. to make shoes and T-shirts and toasters? Of course not. They're not going to do that. It would never be competitive. It would be too expensive. So tariffs work if you're trying to do import substitution industrialization. If you're trying to replace your dependency on a foreign product through imports, and instead you want to produce those products locally. But if you're not going to produce those products locally, all you're going to have is an increase in cost, increase in price. It's going to become more expensive to import toasters and shoes and T-shirts. So, I mean, Trump, he just says these words, tariffs. He said he thinks I'm going to make a deal as if that's going to solve everything. It's not. And of course, we're still very on the early stages of the Trump administration, so I think people still believe him. But once we're in a few years and people see that he's not going to accomplish what he said he would, I think it'll become very obvious that this is just a superficial claim that there's a super easy, magical solution to complex problems.
The very idea, too, of approaching negotiations with Russia before even a phone call, because first of all, the Trump administration said that they've made contact with the Russian side. Russia is saying they don't necessarily agree with that. They haven't heard from them. So there hasn't really been contact established. And then there's this trend, and this was a theme also in the first Trump administration, of, okay, we're going to handle things like a big businessman. We're going to be very hard on the other side and kind of squeeze them into making a deal, because that's what businesses are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to get up on their competition, but and sit on them and make them kind of cry until they give up. Well, the problem is that Russia is not a business. This conflict in Ukraine is not a business, and we already have a track record in the first Trump administration where this just didn't work.
Yeah, again, this just comes back to the very basic question. What more could he sanction or tariff? Again, there's very little trade between. The whole point of tariffs is that you use your domestic market as collateral, as leverage. Okay, so he's saying to Russia, we're going to put tariffs on you, therefore you won't be able to export to the U.S. market. But Russia's exporting very little to the U.S. market. And like I said, what is the main thing that Russia, even if it is still exporting little, what is it exporting? The main product it's exporting is petroleum. The U.S. is the world's largest oil producer. It can find many alternatives to Russian petroleum. Russia doesn't need the U.S. market to export its oil to. So tariffs for Russia, it doesn't matter. This threat of tariffs only makes sense if it actually is concerned about maintaining its access to the U.S. market. For instance, in the case of China, yes, the threat of tariffs is more real because China still does a lot of trade with the United States, unlike Russia. Although even then, China's trade with the U.S. is becoming less and less important over time. China's largest trading partner now is ASEAN, Southeast Asia. It trades more with ASEAN than with the U.S., and it trades more with the Global South and BRICS countries than with the entire West. And over time, we're seeing that further divergence, more and more economic integration of the BRICS countries, and less Chinese reliance on Western markets. So even then, the threat of tariffs on China is becoming less and less powerful over time. As for Russia, this is just, they don't care at all about the threat of U.S. tariffs. Sanctions, again, they can't be sanctioned anymore. Trump thinks he can just pressure Russia into signing some kind of deal that's advantageous to the U.S., but Russia is already one of the most heavily sanctioned countries on earth. It's already been waging this engaged in this war in Ukraine against NATO. It's not against just Ukraine, it's against NATO. Russia's winning this war against NATO. They have the momentum. The leverage is on Russia's side, not on the US side. And yet Trump comes in and thinks he can just magically force Russia to come to the negotiating table. I think it's going to be very clear, again, very soon, that it's just bravado. It's just bluffing.